Hello, I'm Fenella Morris. I'm an QC at 39 Essex Chambers, and I'm here with Kelly Stricklin-Coutinho, another barrister at 39 Essex, to present a webinar jointly with Sport Resolutions. The subject matter of the webinar is state aid and its impact on sport in the light of the coronavirus. We'll be taking you through some of the key elements of the law of state aid, talking about how important it is for sport, particularly sporting venues, commercial side of sport, and its role in social policy, regeneration projects and local development projects. Then we'll take you through the changes in the state aid rules in the light of the coronavirus, talk about what's already been going on in the world of sport in the light of that, and then about some of the opportunities and risks that are coming up in the future, particularly as we come out of lockdown and think about getting the economy and sporting life going again. We'd like to make this webinar as interactive as we can within the technology. So we're able to take questions if you type them in to the chat box on Zoom. We'll keep an eye on them as they come along and we'll try and deal with them if they fit in with our topics. Otherwise, we'll have a question and answer session at the end. So do type them in and we'll try to fit in as many as we can. I'm now going to hand over to Kelly. She's going to take you through the key elements of state aid law and why it's important for sport, and then talk about the temporary framework and what's been happening with that so far. So over to Kelly.
Thank you very much, Fenella. So turning to my first slide, what is state aid? Let's start with the basics of what state aid is. State aid is a part of EU law and it's designed to help to make sure that the internal market within the EU remains competitive. And specifically, it regulates what assistance a member state is able to give to any entity so that no member state can distort markets in a way which isn't justified. State aid is, at heart, in place to ensure that countries don't interfere with the principle of free competition within the internal market. In particular, it prevents inefficient suppliers being kept afloat at the expense of more efficient competitors. And there are therefore rules in place which cover every member state of the EU and what aid those member states are permitted to give. State aid law also seeks to minimise the risk of a subsidies race between member states, ensuring that one country can't strengthen its own interests compared with other countries. For example, if one country chose to grant money to its national airline, that would leave the airline in a stronger financial position compared with national airlines of other countries. They could use that money, for example, to improve their service standards and therefore their market share. State aid also has an impact on competition within each member state, as it applies to all government bodies within the EU. And it's worth noting that common or wider goals might justify accepting some competition distortion, and those justifications can include exceptional circumstances such as these. And in those specific circumstances, state aid will not be prohibited. State aid law also applies to all sectors, but there are, of course, some of particular importance. Some industries which are particularly fraught with difficulty at the moment are sports, culture, travel, and aviation. And with sports, of course, one of the key issues is international competition. So turning to my next slide and what the rules specifically say. The structure of the law is that there is a general prohibition against state aid, and that's set out in Article 107 of the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union. And it prohibits any aid in any form whatsoever granted by a member state or through state resources, which distorts or threatens to distort competition, and which favours certain undertakings and affects trade between member states. In terms of what might be aid, that could be any advantage which is given. The obvious example is a grant, but other examples might be loans given on preferential terms, a state guarantee for lending, or being let off having to pay a charge which is otherwise payable. Also, any aid which is given on market terms will not amount to an advantage and is therefore not in breach of Article 107. And that is known as the market economy operator principle. Importantly for sports, a member state or state resources includes both central government and local authorities. And one key issue is that the measure must be one which is selective, which means that it favours one entity or one particular industry over another. So moving to my next slide, certain types of aid will be considered to be compatible with the internal market, and that includes aid which is designed to make good damage caused by exceptional circumstances, and the Commission has accepted in one of its decisions that the outbreak is an exceptional circumstance. And certain types of aid may be considered to be compatible with the internal market, may rather than shall, and that includes aid which is to remedy a serious disturbance in the economy of a member state. And aid has been accepted by the Commission on both of those bases in the current outbreak. As set out on my next slide, there are a number of exemptions which are available. If any entity complies with all of the conditions attached to the exemption, then the aid may be given without any further recourse to the Commission. And those exemptions include a very small de minimis exemption, which may help some SMEs, and then the general block exemption regulation, which has elements which will be applicable in a sporting context. However, if a country wishes to give aid and it doesn't fit within an exemption, then the usual course is that the proposed aid has to be notified to the European Commission, and the aid may only be given once they've approved it, which, as we know, sometimes that takes a matter of months. Turning now to my next slide and to how this is important for sport, there are some specific circumstances in which a country may wish to give state aid to sports. Starting with sporting venues, it's not uncommon for a local authority to own a venue and for there to be a relationship between the local authority and the team for the use of that venue. And that creates a relationship to which state aid law might apply. Even if the local authority doesn't own the venue, it may be a venue in respect of which the local authority can raise charges, whether that's business rates in the normal course of things, or perhaps community infrastructure levy in the construction of a venue. State aid is also relevant for teams. There are countries within the EU which have given grants to those who've lost money because of the cancellation of an event, and they've been reimbursed for lost revenues. Many of you will be familiar with the state aid cases in relation to public funding of Spanish professional football clubs using a number of measures, including a beneficial tax regime. We won't go into any depth on those cases here. State aid may also be relevant to training and community outreach work that teams might do, particularly if they receive government support for that work. And finally, state aid is also relevant for individuals where they are engaged in an economic activity. So sports people may be engaged in economic activities if, for example, they receive sponsorship or royalties in their work outside their club salary. Fenella mentioned the temporary framework that's been put in place to deal with the COVID outbreak, so we'll move on to that now and onto the next slide. In brief terms, the framework sets out what types of measures can be notified to the European Commission to deal with the impact of the outbreak, and also what principles the Commission will use to decide whether aid might be given. The thrust of the framework is to do with liquidity measures. So those are intended to help businesses to stay afloat and to ride out the impact of coronavirus, but it does also deal with other wider reaching measures. The liquidity measures, and the UK's version of those are of general application and are accessible by the sports industry in the same way as any other entity would be able to access it. The wider reaching measures following the framework include direct grants to specific companies and support for particular industries, which the UK has so far only offered on a limited basis and which Fenella will touch on shortly. The breadth of the measures, however, does mean that the Commission envisages help for specific companies and specific industries, and it's a matter for those companies and industries to lobby their government for that particular support. Turning now to my next slide, the key points to note under the framework are measures have to be notified to the Commission for approval, and at the moment approvals are being given very quickly. It's being turned around in a matter of days, not the usual months. It's also important that the measure under the framework must arise from the outbreak, and the remedy for the measure also has to be restricted to dealing with the impact of the outbreak. In the context of the UK, there is the potential for some further measures. So, for example, the provision of equity or hybrid capital instruments where conditions are imposed, likely to be something like the requirement to give undertakings about how money will be used. Lobbying government on what aid sports bodies might seek, either for the industry or for particular companies, is therefore likely to be the next area of focus for those who need more support than is currently available. And on that note, I'm going to hand back to Fenella, who's going to look at some of the domestic issues.
State aid isn't just a matter of European law. We know that it can take a leading role in domestic litigation. And before we think about some of the opportunities and risks there might be for sporting organisations and local and central government, we think it's worth reflecting on what's been happening on the domestic scene, where people have felt that they are losing out because of monies which have been passed to sporting venues from the state. Now, the first example of this is what has become quite a well-known piece of litigation about the Coventry City Football Club. Now, in this case, the owners of the football club brought a challenge to a decision of the council to advance a loan to the leaseholder of the stadium where the club was playing, on the Rico Arena, on the grounds that it was unlawful state aid. The claim arose in the context of what really was quite an unhappy relationship between the owners of the club as the stadium, the owners of the club against the stadium and the council. The council was the freeholder of the stadium and also owned a half interest in the leaseholder. And then the stadium was sublet to the team. The team failed to pay the rent, which put the leaseholder in a state of financial distress. And the council then loaned the leaseholder several £1 million in order to protect the council's interests. The case came before Mr. Justice Higginbottom, as he then was, at first instance, and he took what turned out to be quite an interesting approach, although it's now become established as the correct one. And in a way, he took an approach which was a kind of hybrid of the domestic law of judicial review and the European law of state aid. He didn't put himself in the position of the European Commission deciding whether or not a particular transaction amounted to state aid. Rather, he said the question was, what would a rational private economic operator have done, applying the public law concept of irrationality to the issue? So he was asking himself whether or not what had been done went beyond the bounds of Wednesbury irrationality. Now, in that way, he allowed the council really the widest margin of appreciation or discretion in its decision-making. Now, the owners of the football club appealed that to the Court of Appeal, but that was upheld. And the key part of the judgment is there on the slide. It's only when such conduct can be entirely ruled out as inconceivable that the only remaining plausible explanation for the provision of the public funds is it must be regarded as state aid. And so the crucial feature of that case was that the council had a commercial interest itself in the well-being of the leaseholder, and that made its involvement in the situation and its decision to grant the loan something which was not inconceivable. Now, the case was appealed to the Supreme Court and they weren't granted permission. However, the financial disputes didn't go away. Could you turn to the next slide, please? So the football club brought a fresh action because the way in which matters had developed in the meantime was that the council had extended the leaseholder's lease and it had also sold its shares in the leaseholder to a rugby club, Wasps. Now, the football club was also discontented about this and complained essentially that the extension in the lease had been done at undervalue, and that was also state aid. But in that case, which also proceeded to the Court of Appeal, the court took the same Wednesbury irrationality type approach and analysed the true facts of the transaction and said, no, this isn't state aid. There was again an appeal to the Supreme Court, but permission to appeal was refused. Now, we understand that that case has been the subject of a challenge in the European Commission, but we don't know what's happened about that. As you've been hearing from Kelly, there's quite a lot of activity there, so it might have gone to the bottom of the pile. Now, it's worth thinking about these cases for a few reasons in the context of this talk, because they've got, the transactions concerned have got characteristics which are quite typical. First of all, the stadium was essentially part of a council-led regeneration project, so it was embedded in the council planning. The council had its own substantial financial interest. Now, the council was well aware of the social and economic importance of the club and of the stadium, but those weren't the factors which drove its decision making. So the big takeaway from these judgments is that if there is going to be a challenge domestically to a decision to grant funds which are said to be state aid, it looks as though the domestic courts are going to take quite a broad and permissive approach unless something is inconceivable as something else, it will be waved through. Now, it may be that there still will be claimants that are confident of their claim, perhaps because there are strong facts, perhaps also that a critical issue wasn't taken into account, or because there's been a more obvious or straightforward breach of the rules. Then judicial review could be an attractive option. Judicial review is often an attractive option because, in contrast to the position that Kelly's explained, it tends to proceed a lot more quickly than asking for action on the part of Europe. Although, of course, there are exceptions in some cases. Now, certainly involvement in the development of stadiums isn't the only example, and there are lots of other situations where local and central government has become involved in sport and related issues, but we haven't got case reports in relation to those. Now, I'm going to hand back to Kelly now so she can talk a bit more about the temporary framework that's been developed as a result of coronavirus and what's been done in relation to that so far. So over to Kelly.
Thank you so much, Fenella. The temporary framework provides for some specific types of aid, each of which, if notified, is likely to be approved in the present circumstances. And most relevantly for this context, those include direct grants, tax advantages, and advance payments for grants up to €800,000 to a company to address its urgent liquidity needs. Also state guarantees for loans, subsidising public loans to allow for more favourable interest rates, tax deferrals and wage subsidies. The UK government has already given business rate relief for the year 2020 to 2021 in respect of the retail, hospitality and leisure sectors. That probably does include sports venues and a range of other sporting entities, but any dispute about eligibility has to be taken up with the local authority, and the guidance on what is included is relatively brief, so I think there'll be no surprises if there are challenges in relation to that. Turning to my next slide, and the measures approved across Europe, there are several which will be relevant in this context. There are some measures around liquidity which the sports industry will be able to use simply because of their broad application. And there are also some specific measures which will impact the sports industry. The Swedish measure is an interesting one. This is a measure which the UK has not chosen to replicate in the same way just yet. And in this measure, Sweden has agreed to grant money to those who've cancelled public cultural events for a limited period, so it's up until the end of May. And the reimbursement concerns lost revenues. The decision doesn't say what those revenues include. So for example, does it concern ticket sales or does it include the full range of match day revenues, which will be lost? No doubt there will be more information available domestically in Sweden, but that's certainly an interesting measure of aid to be given to the sports industry. The Bulgarian measure is similarly interesting. It concerns wage subsidies for employees in specific sectors, including the sports sector. And of course, the UK is also subsidising wages to an extent, but the measures are different in nature, as the Bulgarian measure does specifically recognise the impact to the sporting industry. As referred to already, it seems clear that some countries are willing to subsidise particular industries, and some countries are even willing to subsidise particular companies, no doubt from extensive lobbying from that company on the need for support. And as I've noted on the slides, there have been company-specific aids approved, not in relation to sport, but in relation to the Renault Group in France and in relation to SAS in Denmark. It's also apparent that while the raft of measures we have at the moment in the UK is intended to deal with the initial short-term liquidity issues, there might be further changes to the short-term measures. For example, the figures suggest that more than half of UK adults are currently being paid furloughed wages, which is thought to be unsustainable for a long period. And if those measures are to be tightened up, one could see that certain industries may then wish to lobby for particular support for them. Moving on now to my next slide and what other parts of state aid law might help. Well, very importantly, the framework also states that the usual means of giving permitted aid, like using the general block exemption regulation and falling outside of the scope of Article 107, continue to be relevant. And if anything, they might be easier to use because they don't require the scheme to be notified to the Commission in advance, and they may well have lesser reporting and monitoring requirements. For example, any investment by a local authority which is done on market terms means that there will be no advantage to the recipient and no breach of Article 107. And a local authority may consider, therefore, engaging in short to medium term plans for investment, such as a joint venture, with plans to exit the investment. They might also consider other structures for their investment. But the key point for all of those types of investment will be trying to work out what the long-term prospects are. And if there is an exit plan, whether that takes proper account of all the likely circumstances. I'm now going to hand back to Fenella, who's going to talk about some of the longer term opportunities.
So what opportunities are there for us as we start to emerge from lockdown and look to restart sporting life and develop and promote our economies? And how are the state aid rules going to come into play? Well, central government has already recognised the crucial importance of sport to society, both in terms of individual health, public health, the economy and social cohesion. And just in the last couple of weeks, it's made £16 million worth of loans available to Rugby League in order to protect the sport, given its social importance in northern communities and the risk that it might be wiped out. It seems to me that there may well soon be more examples of this. I wonder whether a similar view might be taken given the social and economic significance of some of the lower divisions in football. And I also wonder whether the increasing focus on public health and the risks associated with obesity, which are so intense at the moment, might lead to more decisions to support participative sport, particularly where perhaps there's some sports can only keep going if there's more provision to accommodate some of the risks that are associated with the virus. Now, in the context of local government, before coronavirus, as we've already discussed, local councils were seeing more and more the financial possibilities of sport by involving themselves in stadiums and other facilities as part of their regeneration projects and even other types of land development. And I wonder whether they might even go so far now as to acquire interests in teams given the level of insight demonstrated by central government in terms of their involvement now with granting loans to Rugby League. I think that this financial aspect and the potential financial benefits of involving the state in sport might come further to the fore now, given the massive deficits that local government is facing because they've lost revenue, I mean, partly because of things like sporting and other facilities being closed, and also because of the increased cost of social care. So local government is going to have to look for some pretty radical ways of improving their own subjective financial position. But of course, one of the other big challenges for local government is going to be how to rebuild local connections and the local economy. It seems to me that one of the ways that they might do that is by involving themselves in joint ventures with sporting organisations or venues, and that would give them a chance to make money with a new scheme, but also fulfil social and public health objectives and also economic regeneration objectives. And it seems to me that that leaves us with a really a lot of potential to improve health and well-being of people in this country. One of the other particular aspects of this is the way in which the temporary framework might be expanded to include things like the taking of equity stakes by the state. I mean, in one sense, that's renationalisation, or at least one re-local nationalisation. So what's envisaged, perhaps, is that local or indeed central government might take an equity stake in a project rather than simply making a grant or a loan. This gives them the possibility of profit and also gives them more chance to influence the direction of the organisation. Just looking at things in pure commercial terms, it's important that sporting teams and stadium owners and others don't overlook all of the measures that have already been approved by the Commission or are in play to enable them to ride out the short-term effects of coronavirus. Obviously, a lot of people will know about CBILS, but perhaps what hasn't necessarily been thought about by sporting bodies, as far as I can see, is the use to them of the COVID Corporate Financing Facility, CCFF. It really trips off the tongue. And I can see how perhaps a large football team might be able to meet the test that's been laid down by the Bank of England of making a material contribution to the UK economy, and also having been in sound financial health before the shutdown. Any organisation meeting these tests might be eligible for this form of commercial paper, which would give 12 months financial easing. Now, one of the reasons why there are inhibitions on that prevention derived from European law, which is a concern that a body which is subject to public law might not be entitled. Now, at the moment, there's a degree of uncertainty about who might fit the bill for that. But it seems to me that the right way to look at it is to look at the purpose of this facility. The purpose of this facility is to support organisations that make a material contribution to the UK economy. And if you look at it in those terms again, I think it's the type of thing that might be available and suitable for some large sporting bodies that were in good health. Could you take us to the next slide, please? Now, I've said that there are lots of opportunities, and this takes the form both of the sort of traditional ways in which it's been possible to access funding without falling for the state aid rules, but also because the temporary framework, which doesn't appear at the moment to be time limited, does really open up the possibility of a bit of a bonanza if a local government, central government and sport try to work together. That said, every opportunity comes with a set of risks, and if we can turn to the next slide, I'm going to talk about those now. Now, we know that one way in which risks arise is in challenges between countries. And Kelly's talked about some of the measures we have, and there's already concern about inequality between countries. So, for example, the Financial Times has reported that Germany has so far granted half of all the money that has been granted under the relaxation of the state aid rules. And Spain and Italy are pretty discontented about that. If one country becomes very proactive in its use of these easements in the rules to make loans or grants or other facilities, then that intensifies the risk of challenge. One of the other possibilities is that specific organisations within a country challenge them. So another example of that is that Ryanair, who's always quite quick to complain, they've already threatened to challenge the decision of the Danish government, which Kelly referred to grant support of its domestic airline. And more recently, Ryanair is also saying that it's going to complain about the actions that the French and German governments have taken in relation to theirs. So you can see how those kind of antagonisms might map across to sport. So, for example, if the German government were to provide a lot of support to its football teams, you can see how either the Spanish and Italian government or the Spanish and Italian teams might be dissatisfied. Equally, if there were the support given to stadiums, there might also be antagonism, and that could go wider, because one of the things that we saw from the Coventry City case was that that stadium, being a very high-grade facility, was also used for cultural events. And therefore, that's another aspect of competition which might be objected to. And of course, those who organise cultural events are confronting some of the same problems in terms of logistics and economics that sporting organisations are. And so there are a large number of risks. It seems to me that there are also risks within the country. It may be that there'll be some councils who are innovative to the point of aggression in supporting local endeavours, and it might be those who are competitors within the country might take exception to that. Now, they are those who might most particularly seek to bring a challenge by way of judicial review. And although, as we've seen, the bar that someone granting this kind of facility has to step over is relatively low, it's nevertheless the case that it's hugely disruptive and risky to be involved in litigation. Now, given that there are these risks, what are the best ways that bodies who are looking to involve themselves in these projects can try to mitigate them? Well, the answer, as ever, is to analyse carefully the economics of the situation and get solid, independent evidence on the commercial realities and the options. And if you've got that quality of evidence, then you ought to be able to bring yourself, if needed, within the band of what's conceivable. The other thing to bear in mind about this potential bonanza situation, which we've talked about, is to pick up the thread that Kelly started. So typically we're used to applications for approval of state aid taking absolutely ages, but currently they're being granted very quickly. And it seems to me that if you can identify an urgent need, then that would be a good reason to move on, ask for your approval, or see if you can bring yourself within one of the traditional exceptions, and then sit back and wait and see. Could I have the next slide, please? Now, whenever we get asked to advise on these topics, there's normally a final question of the set of instructions, which is, what difference will Brexit make? And at the moment, I think we've all stopped thinking about it quite as much as we used to. However, Brexit is still coming, as far as we can tell. Nothing's stopped it yet. But one of the interesting things about Brexit is it will take the decision-making about whether something is or isn't state aid into the future, away from Europe for us, and put it in the hands of the Competition and Markets Authority. Now, because that's a domestic body, it leads to quite a lot of interesting questions about whether there might be a difference in emphasis or a difference in nuance or approach. And if you imagine the situation that we're going to be in the next few months or even years of a great deal of economic pressure, a need for innovation, a need to inflate the economy, build communities, regenerate business, then one can't help wondering whether the approach of the Competition and Markets Authority might be more accommodating, particularly if that's the approach that central government takes. For example, you can think about Dominic Cummings and his kind of buy British impulses. In that sense, one might imagine that there could perhaps be a less bureaucratic approach, one which reaches decisions more quickly. And perhaps, again, bearing in mind that we've had this strong steer from the Court of Appeal approved by the Supreme Court, that, you know, if you can put together a sensible case why something isn't state aid, then you can jolly well get on and do it. With that steer from the courts and a positive economic will, then one can perhaps imagine quite easily that, again, there might be more fuel to this bonanza. One of the more tricky questions, though, is what's going to happen when the temporary framework ends, and what kind of instructions there'll be for phasing things out. So, for example, the loans that have been provided to Rugby League are just that, they're loans, and they're going to have to be repaid one day. One of the questions that's already been asked is, well, how's that going to work going forward? But if one thinks about some of the other more novel suggestions which might be permitted, like the grant of an equity stake, or once a public body has got an equity stake in an organisation, what's the status of that going to be? Will it be allowed to remain there in the long term, or will be some a requirement of divestment? And that's perhaps a real imponderable and a difficult to quantify risk. What's interesting, of course, is if there is a big bonanza in state aid under these easements of the temporary framework, we're going to wake up in a year's time with a lot more public investment of various kinds in sport and other types of activity. And I wonder whether in the end, people will find that that suits them very well on both sides, and they like to carry on in that way, or whether there'll be some desire to row back, or whether the Competition and Markets Authority will be happy to leave it as it is and promote things. Now I'm going to turn now to the questions part of the seminar. I can see that people have been typing in some questions. And so because I've been talking, I'm hoping that Kelly's been thinking, and I'm going to let her start with the question of her choice.
Thank you very much, Fenella. I'm going to pick up the question. It really adds to the point that you were discussing earlier around how you might expect the end of transition period for the UK leaving the EU to alter the state aid landscape. And the additional point that I find quite interesting here is that, of course, state aid law is going to apply domestically in the UK as well. And I alluded earlier to the fact that the reason or the rationale for having state aid law is that it polices competition across the EU, but it's also really important for regional competition within a member state. And that strikes me as quite interesting, because I can see the potential for aid to be given in whatever form in a different way in the different regions within the UK. And I can see that that might potentially cause, well, a bit of a scrap, to put it bluntly, as to whether that's being allocated fairly. That seems to me quite a big issue for sports. And I think the CMA will be quite interested in those issues. They're the types of issues that the CMA are probably quite used to dealing with. And perhaps the CMA will be slightly more interested in the internal issues to the UK than perhaps the European Commission would have been otherwise. I mean, I think, you know, we've known that the Commission has always taken the approach of being big on big things and small on small things, and very often the regional issues that we have within a country are regarded as the small things. So I can see there might be a bit more of a focus on those differences in regions and how they're treated, and I can also see that competitors might seek to invoke the CMA's interest on some of those regional scraps as well. So I can see that technically, as a matter of law, there probably isn't much of a change, but as a matter of practice, there might be a slightly different way of approaching regional aid in the UK, and that might particularly impact sports.
I think that's incredibly interesting. So, for example, the money that has been paid to rugby league in the north, I can see that there might equally be, you know, the lower divisions, football in other areas saying, well, we're just as important socially, we've got just as intense financial vulnerabilities. How come they've got money and we haven't? And is that unlawful state aid? And bringing the kind of claim, for example, that the football club did in the Coventry City case. And certainly at the point when there was a lot of discussion about how state aid might work when the country was considering whether or not to Brexit, there were suggestions at the time, oh, well, state aid law won't apply. But of course, there are still going to be effectively more domestic sized antagonisms, and each area is going to want to be treated just as well, if not better. Now, we've got a question up here, which is very interesting, and I'm not sure that I know the entire answer, but I'm going to start talking about it. And I'm going to hope that Kelly chips in, but I think it's a really, really interesting question. So what we're being asked is that some sporting bodies operate within a EU-based competitive framework. And if they operate within an EU-based competition-based framework, what does that mean for how they might be treated in state aid terms? And I think that points up the kind of difficulties that we are suggesting might arise. So one can well imagine that if you are competing against a sporting body in another country, and that sporting body is the recipient of loan or some kind of tax regime or whatever it is, a grant, some kind of public investment, which is making it easier for them to function, then you may well be significantly antagonized. And that's the kind of thing that you might want to object to. Kelly, is there anything you want to add to in relation to that?
Yes, please, if you don't mind. The thing that I find quite interesting about this is it reflects what I think is potentially a problem for state aid generally going forward after Brexit, because we have, for a certain amount of time, both the Commission and the CMA having oversight of state aid in relation to certain parts. I think it's fair to say that early on in the Brexit negotiations, there probably wasn't as much discussion or liaison between the CMA and DG Comp as one might hope. I'm sure that's probably changed by now. But I think there is a potential for a divergence just as a matter of practicality. If they're not speaking to each other day to day to make sure they've got a common approach, then that might be a problem. But of course, the other thing is, don't forget, the Commission's enforcement of state aid is driven by European Commission policy on state aid and competition. The CMA will not be setting state aid policy. That's going to be something which will be determined by other parts of government. And so you can see there is a potential for there to be a clash between state aid policy in the UK, state aid policy at the level of the Commission, and then potentially between the enforcement as well. So I think there are some real issues here, and I think there is a real potential for divergence, which will manifest themselves in that way that's been described.
I mean, I think that's very interesting, because it throws up the possibility that we have a more permissive regime from the CMA, but that leads to antagonism. So, for example, were central government to decide that it was going to do make provision in the way that it has to rugby league more extensively to other sports, some of those sports might be those who are involving some of those who are playing within European competitive arrangements. If they then complain to the EU, I wonder how that would play out. Would it end up playing out politically as much as legally? I don't know, Kelly, whether you've got any insights in relation to that.
Well, I would just say that state aid and sport, in particular football, is a fundamentally political issue within the EU. I mean, there have been cases about how Spain in particular has enforced, has sought to put in place measures which help its football teams. And the reality is, if we look at the scale of aid that's being given under the temporary framework, there are some countries which are simply able to provide a great deal more aid. And it's already become quite a political issue as to how far those richer countries are able to go. I do think that the aid provided to sports teams is going to be something which is going to be quite a close focus for competitors in other countries in particular.
We've got a new question, which I really like, which is whether the government might end up preferring some sports over others, and how that might play out in terms of challenge. And I think that's a fantastic question. Obviously, there's been a lot of media noise about football, but there hasn't been anything like as much noise in relation to some of the other sports. I think there are a couple of strands to this that I would like to think about. One is participation. So one of the things that I find particularly interesting about sport is how it's a mechanism for social change and local economic development. And I wonder whether if there are innovative councils, that's something that's going to be critically significant. They're going to look at what sport is going to bring people in and get them all working together again, what sport is going to improve the health of the community, and they're not going to be as interested in things which have a higher profile. So if you think about the kind of things like Park Run, which have made a huge change, I'm wondering whether other initiatives like that are the kind of things that might be receptive. Oh, and someone suggested maybe cricket. Well, I don't know. I might imagine that I don't know enough about cricket, but I'm imagining that's the kind of thing which might be suitable for development because it's got a higher level of participation, and that's something that might be prioritised. I think that the other aspect to it, though, is the fact that local government might be interested in doing something which is going to make money. And in those circumstances, they might end up involving themselves in projects with larger money-making schemes. And of course, if they were to take such a sort of narrow or shallow view, you can see why others who are able to lobby and argue for sport as something which is participative might take a different approach, and that might lead to a challenge. And in fact, one could even see that there might be equality duty-based challenges, which I think might be quite interesting as well. Kelly, have you got anything to add to that?
Yeah, just a thought on the different types of aid that are available and the circumstances in which you might try to give it. So it seems to me that there are a really, really broad range of organisations and activities which might be amenable to receive aid. And of those, you might do things in different ways. So for example, if you were looking at very junior teams or grassroots sports, you might find that the types of aid that are given are things like grants from European funds at the moment, or post-Brexit funds which are designed to replace European funds. And those are going to be relatively small scale, and they will be very much supporting the social side, as you've alluded to. But the different, the larger types of investment, which tend much towards the commercial, will just have a different source altogether. You know, they won't necessarily be European funds. That will be local authorities, for example, trying to be entrepreneurial, or it might be other sources of government which want to engage in a more commercial way. So I think the sources will be potentially really quite different for those two things, and potentially have quite a varying approach from the government perspective.
I mean, picking up from that, there's another fantastic question which has really set me thinking, which is about the significance of disability in all of this. And if there is going to be more understanding and focus on public health, which I think there should be, I also wonder whether there could be some interesting challenges to decisions if money is going to be allocated in any character without the local authority thinking about its public sector equality duty. So those of us who practice in public law will know that the public sector equality duty is an absolute goldmine in one sense for litigation, and certainly a trap for unwary government bodies. If local or central government are thinking about making provision for sport in any way, and they do that without thinking about the significance of disability in that, then they could quite quickly become unstuck. I'm afraid I'm not sufficiently knowledgeable to know whether there are particular sports where there are, there's better level of participation by people with disabilities or not, but that's the kind of thing, or whether equally there would be a particular encouragement for particular groups, and there might then be some kind of funding allocated on this basis. But certainly I think if decisions are being made to support sport, particularly where it relates to participation, without thinking about the equalities impact, then that might be ripe for challenge. I don't know whether it might even go so far as to be a possibility of any gender-based challenge, or even BMA challenges. I don't know enough about how the landscape will work out, but I certainly think it's a potential issue. I don't know if Kelly's got anything she'd want to add to that.
Nope, nothing on that.
And so we've got a question about if sports aren't competing with one another, is there a way of saying, well, then there isn't a distortion of competition? I'm not sure that it's as straightforward as that, actually, because I think that sport is more, it has more homogeneous aspects than heterogeneous aspects in lots of ways. And if a lot of money were to go into football, for example, that would necessarily mean that some of the other funding that flows into an organization, you know, sort of match day receipts or whatever, or the ability to provide a nicer stadium, which means that you can then have other kinds of events there, are the kind of things that might play out. So I don't think it's necessarily as simple as saying, oh, we can divide up between sports. But I don't know whether Kenny's got any thoughts about that.
I think as a sort of a starting point, if a measure is given, let's say, let's take a relief from tax or something like that, because it's a nice straightforward example. But if a measure was given, which was specifically for the sporting industry as a whole, or even within particular sports, I think the question then is what the comparison is. And I think, like you, Fenella, it's not quite as straightforward as just saying that's a simple carve out. The nature of sports business is, in my experience at least, rarely just about ticket sales. You know, a lot of the venues will have a range of different sources of income, and their competitors may not just be other sports teams. So many of them will provide conferencing facilities, or might be a venue which is suitable for doing, say, theatre or concerts or whatever. And in that case, the range of different competitors is really quite broad. So I think looking at whether or not the selectivity criterion is met is partly to do with the general applicability of the measure. So is it one which has a specific carve out for a specific type of industry or particular type of activity? And then looking at who exactly the competitors might be. I think it's not necessarily a straightforward answer.
So the next question that I've got is relates to whether publicly funded sports have got any way of challenging decisions where some state aid is provided to more well-off sports. I think I'm not sure whether you would be able to challenge it simply on the basis that they've got lots of money and you haven't, except you might say, well, what's the purpose of this? And what you're doing is not consistent with the purpose, and therefore perhaps it's irrational. So, for example, when you look at the temporary framework, there's a big focus on allowing people to cope with the effects of the pandemic. But I wonder whether, you know, well, yes, everybody's been affected, or a large majority of people have been affected by the pandemic, but whether what's more interesting is saying, well, what's the underlying purpose of this funding? Is it directed at public health? If it's directed at public health, well, then this isn't a very good way of spending your money. Or you might say, well, you've made this decision. The other way of attacking it might be say, well, you've made this decision, but you haven't thought about all the relevant factors. I mean, that would also run alongside the kind of equality duty challenge that there might be. And so, although it's not straightforward, I can see that there are possibilities there. I don't know if Kelly's got any other ideas.
No, nothing further on that.
And then there's another interesting question about the ownership structures of sports clubs. I'm not a huge expert in this, but I think what is interesting is the question of whether you have other types of stake in a club, financial stake, which isn't purely driven commercially. I suppose it ties in with one of the points that Kelly touched upon earlier. One of the concerns is that people will use the financial distress of organisations as a result of the coronavirus to swoop in and make, straightforwardly commercial purchases, and whether there are particular risks that we ought to guard against there. I don't know if there's anything that you want to develop on that point, Kelly.
Yes, I'm itching to talk about this one.
Oh, good.
I think this is really interesting because obviously it's not an uncommon phenomenon in sports to have a high net worth individual investor who owns a team, and it may not necessarily just be a high net worth. It might be, like in the example of the Coventry Football Club case, it might be something like a hedge fund. One of the issues that the Commission has been looking at in state aid as a whole, so not necessarily just in relation to sports, is what happens when we have within the EU fairly tight state aid control, which means that countries are largely restricted in how they invest in their own teams, for example. But then we end up essentially with a relatively inexpensive purchase of a team over here, particularly when we're looking at global competition. So one of the issues that the Commission has been looking at is whether it's sensible to allow some kind of relaxation of the regulations on what investments governments can make within the EU, so that they can, in a sense, try to prevent the issue of other foreign investors coming in and buying up relatively cheaply things like sports teams. So I think that's very much a watch this space situation, because I think the Commission is developing its thinking on that and what might be permissible. But I think that might involve actually quite a substantial change in the fundamentals of how state aid applies, and it could well make a big difference in how it applies for sports.
There's another question here which is taking me back to one of my hobby horses, so it's great that we get to talk about the things that we like to talk about, and it is the public benefits provided by sport or a particular organisation. And I wouldn't mind going on about this a bit more for a few minutes, if given I'm going to be indulged, and I've been prompted to do so. So what's interesting to me is that there's increasing understanding of the function that sport has in bringing people together. But it also has, quite tangible benefits in terms of public health, and it looks to me as though we're all going to become a bit more alert about that and concerned about it. And I think what's interesting is that if we start to think about sport not just as entertainment, or sport isn't just a way to make money, but it has these wider public goods associated with it, that's going to make local and central government perhaps more thoughtful about whether it is worth spending money. But I agree with the questioner, it also means that perhaps they're going to look at how the sport manages itself, conducts itself, governs itself before it starts dishing out the cash. And I think it also ties in with what I was saying earlier about what might happen if what's decided is the kind of investment is equity investment. And therefore there's some sort of control and direction from the public body. Now, I guess in lots of ways it is a political question. Well, should we just let, football or whatever it is run on and be concerned with, being fun to watch and people making lots of money? Or is there actually something more that we can get from our football clubs? And should we say, well, if you want the government to support you, then there's a quid pro quo to that, which is that you think more about what public benefit you might be providing. And it seems to me that at that level, we're at quite an interesting juncture in terms of the deals that might be struck, having lots of factors, not just being about a number, but being about what contribution is being made to society. So I don't know whether I've got too sentimental now. Kelly will probably tell me whether or not I have. But I also wonder whether the extent to which that would fit within the traditional state aid framework, or whether we might end up having lots of problems if we look at it that way. What do you think, Kelly?
No, I agree with what you say.
Oh, that's great. Have we got any more questions?
There is another question we haven't.
Oh, yes. Oh, would you want to start with that then?
Yeah, which is whether the basic legal approach will remain the same post-Brexit. So, for example, the Competition Act continue to mirror Articles 101 and 102. In short, yes. Everything at the moment, at least, is likely to stay the same. I think really the bigger question is what happens as we look at the deal that we have with the EU, and what happens when we look at the types of competition terms we would want to have in any free trade agreements. There's obviously a natural tension there, because in order to have a proper deal going forward with the EU, we need to be as closely aligned with them as we can. State aid is one of the issues in respect to which the Commission has said they want to make sure there is a level playing field. So they're going to be very careful about that. They'll also be very careful about tax and some other matters. And I can see that competition law as a whole is going to be something that really matters very much for our relationship with the EU. And so I think as a matter of practicality, if we make a political decision that we want to stay fairly closely aligned with the EU, then we do have to make sure that going forward, those provisions do continue to mirror. So in the short to medium term, yes, for sure. And then looking further forward, probably still yes. Fenella, did you have any views on that?
No, I don't have anything to add to that, but we have got a wonderful question about Dominic Cummings, which I think it would be fun to answer. Someone's asking whether we should have Dominic Cummings on the board. I'm assuming of the Board of Sport Resolutions, or maybe it's of any organisation. I'm not sure, but I can see why you might want to spend more time engaging with people who are concerned with public health. I mean, they've become very visible in the last couple of months. Typically, public health isn't just about disease, but more about the sort of causes of disease. I sound a bit like Tony Blair now, getting very political. But I can see why there might be something to be said for finding a new way into government and getting them to think about this. But I also think that perhaps where you're going to get a more receptive ear is in local government, where there are quite a lot of innovators at a high level in local government who could easily be persuaded that one of the ways of improving their local community in all sorts of ways is by some sort of sport related joint venture, because as Kelly said, any sporting event will have a whole surrounding penumbra of financially beneficial endeavors. The people who sell the snacks and the drinks, the people who sell the merchandise or whatever it is. There'll be all sorts of things going on around any event. If the sporting body then has some kind of outreach arrangement, that could be positive. And so I wonder whether you might get a more sympathetic hearing from local government, although I certainly wouldn't discourage you from having your central government. I'm just not sure of the best way in at the moment.
Can I add to that, Fenella? I think state aid, wherever you're looking at it being enforced, whether it's local government, central government, or indeed at the EU, is, to my experience, a fundamentally political subject. There are certainly decisions at the EU level where you look at the decision that's been taken, and then perhaps it's changed fairly shortly thereafter, and the reasoning for the change doesn't perhaps quite hold up to as much scrutiny as it should. But state aid is fundamentally political, and so I don't think that's likely to change. It's just a matter of how you draw on those particular political influences. As you say, central government and local government will have quite different objectives, so they might have different ways of working, and I think local government might have a bit more flexibility as to what they can do.
I mean, I certainly think that there is a lot of opportunity for innovative local government. I think the risk is that if, a council does do something innovative, which involves spending money or loans or whatever, then there might be someone in another area who is not happy about that because, their team or whatever isn't getting the same benefit. and there could be a challenge on that basis. But I suppose what's then interesting is whether the CMA, as I expect it will be them, are going to be quite neutral about that, or whether also what view they might take if what the driver is something which is non-economic. I'm not sure. What I'm not sure about is the extent to which that might make the CMA be more relaxed or less relaxed when there are sort of disputes within the country. I don't know if Kelly's got any thoughts about that.
Well, one thought that arises for me is when you have a sort of a mixed use venue, for example. So, you might have a venue where you have a big sporting event, maybe it's even a national or global type sporting event, and then alongside it they have, I don't know, regional theatre productions, and perhaps conferencing facilities. And I can see that all of those different types of activity in a venue might have quite different policy considerations behind them. You might really want to work quite hard to encourage your regional theatre. It may be that there's lots of, I don't know, work with the local community or with young people or something like that, which might have a more social nature than, say, the big commercial, world sporting event that happens there for, 10 days of the year or whatever.
So I think we've run out of questions. Kelly, have you got any other observations that you'd like to make arising out of the discussion we've had so far?
No, nothing from me.
I have really enjoyed participating in the webinar. The questions have been absolutely fantastic. And I think it's a reflection of the fact that state aid and sport is really quite a hot topic at the moment. And I think there's going to be a lot of activity in this area in the next few months, year, possibly longer, with a lot of opportunity for development and a lot of opportunity to do some positive things in terms of public benefit, and possibly also to do some good commercial deals. And I think that in that sense, I would really encourage people to go out and think about new ways of functioning and doing deals with one another, because I think there's quite a lot to change. And if people have a desire to lobby central government as well as to burrow into their local government, I would definitely go ahead and encourage them to do that. So thank you very much for being such a fantastic virtual audience. It's been a really, really great first seminar for sport resolutions. Thank you.